Hello, everyone. Hi, good evening. Welcome to Northeastern University. It's so great to see so many people here in person. And also welcome to those of you who are joining online. I gather we've managed to bring in a hotspot, so things are working. My name's Elizabeth Hudson, and I'm the Dean of the College of Arts, Media, and Design. And I'm so thrilled to welcome Wes Lowery here tonight to relaunch the CAMD Dean's Distinguished Lecture Series for the first time since the pandemic. We are honored to be hosting such an important conversation about race and objectivity in the newsroom. This series invites some of the most prominent minds working today to examine the most pressing issues of our time. And in the light of last year's protests and the ongoing movement towards a more equitable society, today's discussion could not be more timely or necessary. Crucially, over the last year, we've all had to come to terms with the fact that now more than ever, the future of journalism is inextricably tied with the future of our democracy. Because of that, it behooves us all to be engaged with discussions over how journalism and journalists are trying to answer complex questions about the nature of information and misinformation, the ways to think and talk and write about racism, and how best to support equity as a value we all might embrace, but that's nevertheless so difficult to achieve. Over the past year, and for many years prior, faculty and students across CAMD, and in particular from the School of Journalism and the Department of Communication Studies and Media and Screen Studies, have been increasingly engaged in studying the intersection of race and empowerment, activism, and new media. So it is fitting and exciting that we're getting ready to launch a new Center for Communication, Media Innovation, and Social Change to examine these issues. And we're so pleased to welcome with us this fall the prominent scholar of reparative journalism, Meredith Clark, who's here, as the inaugural director of this new center. And with this new center, we will have more opportunities to continue conversations such as the one this evening. So thank you all for joining us. And I'm now going to turn it over to Jonathan Kaufman, who's the director of the School of Journalism and a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter and editor who's worked for Bloomberg News, The Wall Street Journal, and the Boston Globe. Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And as you said, I think we're all thrilled to be able to gather together, even with masks, but to kind of start rejoining our community and talking about this issue. I want to thank Dean Hudson for supporting us in preparing this event and making it making it the first Dean's Lecture of the almost post-pandemic period. We're thrilled to have Wes Lowery with us. Wes is 31 years old, and in his decade as a professional journalist has really blazed a trail across newsrooms and in the public by his work. Many of you have read his work in class or talked about it or brought it up as we've been discussing a lot of these issues involving police violence, the racial reckoning in newsrooms, and the broader questions that raises about us as journalists as well as about the country. Starting with an internship at the Boston Globe and other publications, Wes went on to the Washington Post, where he was assigned to cover the Ferguson demonstrations, which then morphed into a series of path-breaking articles looking at police violence and ultimately the Fatal Force Project, which looked at the police killings around the country, setting up a database, and won the Pulitzer Prize. Wes was the lead reporter on that, and he was talking with some students earlier and was talking about the importance of these collaborative projects where you can lead them when you're very young and all the fights that go on while you're trying to put them together. And Wes has been fighting that fight really wherever he's been. Wes also wrote a terrific book about Ferguson and about questions around police and African Americans called They Can't Kill Us All. Wes is now a correspondent for CBS News, where, as he says, he's adding to his toolbox of skills, producing videos and fronting videos for CBS. That idea of adding to your toolbox of skills, even after an extraordinary print career, is something that I'm hoping is going to resonate with all of you as students, because it's one of the things I think all your professors are kind of repeating over and over again, that knowing print, knowing audio, knowing video, knowing data are all part of learning how to tell stories and improving our storytelling skills. Wes has also established himself as a leading voice of a new generation of journalists, led by journalists of color, who are questioning a lot of the traditional notions of newsroom objectivity and prompting a reexamination of the traditional whiteness of newsrooms, news leadership, and I have to say, journalism schools. He's leading a discussion on what I think of as the new ethics for the 21st century for journalists, which grapples with questions of identity, social justice, social media, and the way we tell our stories. Wes is going to talk for about half an hour, and then we'll open it up to questions. We're going to ask those of you who have questions to just line up over there on the right. We'll give you a microphone to ask your questions. I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions and to engage in a conversation with Wes after his remarks. So please join me in welcoming Wes Lowery.
Well, thank you guys. I haven't been in a room with this many people since the Trump administration, I think, and so it's been a while. I appreciate you all being here, and it's really great to be back in Boston. I was here for two stints that were pretty young or pretty short back when I was first getting into my career, and so it's a city that means a lot to me. I had arrived here 1 month prior to the Boston Marathon bombings, and if there were 100 people at the Globe who contributed to that, I was number 99 on the team, probably. I was getting coffee for folks and feeding a few quotes in, but it's still one of the teams I was most proud to have been a member of. And it was such a remarkable way to get to know a city in a moment after such tragedy, and then also not long after that in helping cover the mayor's race in 2013 as well. And so Boston's a city that is near and dear to my heart. And so any excuse to come back and hang out and see some friends is something I always take. A few quick housekeeping things, and then I'll talk for a minute, and then I'll shut up, and then we'll talk for a minute. First is that I always say this at the end, but I want to say this at the beginning as well. Any way I can be helpful to any of you all, please let me know. I'm really easy to find. I'm on social media on all the various things. My emails are in all of my bios, and I can procrastinate my various jobs by instead trying to be helpful to random students who I don't know. And so please help me miss my deadlines by asking me questions. And so that would be great. And like I said, I also am pretty active on all the various social media platforms. And so that, if I can be helpful with that as well, add me in those various places. The other thing I was going to say is that there's been a lot of conversation this last year and a half about journalism and our role in democracy and about the ideals we hold up and aspire to and what words and language we use. And there have been a lot of debates about words, and some might say word games about some of the words, and I've certainly engaged in some of that. But I think that there's really broad agreement across our industry, especially I see and I sense, especially from the young people who make up the future of the industry, a lot of the people in the room now, about the importance of journalism in our democracy, the importance of truth, the importance of facts, the power of the Fourth Estate to hold powerful people and powerful actors accountable, and to ensure justice and equality and equity for people who are less powerful in our society. And I think that it's important to affirm that importance now and up front at a time when a lot of people are critical of the work that we do, and critical in a different way. Because what I would say is that, without getting political, what I would say is I think there are two different types of media critic. There are people who criticize the media because they want to tear it down because they're scared of the power of the media, because they know the media is the potential check to their own abuses or misbehaviors. And then there are people who critique media because they understand and believe in the power of media and they want it to be better wielded, that they want and believe in a stronger and better journalism. And I think that And I think that it's important to separate those things. And as someone who hopes that I exist in that second bucket, I think it's important to affirm the power and importance of journalists and media and the work that we do, and the hardworking people across the country. I know we'll probably end up talking about, one of the things I say is, I'm never going to write an op-ed again because I'll never get to stop talking about the op-ed. But I know we'll talk and dive into some of the questions about what is going on in this moment and how we talk about social media, how we express ourselves as individuals, and how much of that should be, subsumed by our identities as journalists. But rather than kind of lecture or talk about that kind of stuff, because I know that we'll have a better conversation around that from your questions, I wanted to just kind of talk a little bit about my career and about some of the stories I've worked on as a means of setting the table for you all understanding kind of where I come from and the work that I've been doing, and to perhaps provide some examples of how and why I think about the industry the way I do. So I always tell people that, I didn't have much of a choice but to become a journalist. I figured out pretty early on that I was all right at it, that I really enjoyed it. This idea of being able to collect information, calling anyone in the world that I wanted to and asking them whatever questions I wanted, and they had to give me all this information, and then I could disseminate it and give it to people. I remember working for my 8th grade newspaper and breaking the news that they were cutting the number of minutes between classes from 4 minutes to 3 minutes. And I remember walking from English class to English class, handing out these papers and watching the horror in the faces of these 7th and 8th graders as they realized they would have to completely recalibrate routes. They would go meet their girlfriend between math class, but now they wouldn't have time to do that, and then get all the way back to the South Wing before history class. It was throwing off trips to vending machines and bathrooms, and seeing as my classmates vowed to do something about this. They were going to tell their parents, they were going to storm to the principal's office, and it was a remarkable example in the power of journalism. That we collect information, we give the information to people, and that information empowers them to react, to rebel, to push back. And there was something just really intoxicating about that. So I signed up for my Journalism 101 class in high school, and went and proceeded to spend every day of my high school life in the journalism room, much to the detriment or much to the chagrin of my science and math teachers, who saw very little of me, and camped out, in my high school journalism class, and went off to college in Ohio at Ohio University, which is the best journalism school in Ohio, where I camped out in my college newspaper, again, to the chagrin of most of my professors and my transcripts. And by that point, journalism was something I was getting good at and was the only thing I was good at. I didn't have many other options. I knew I was going to have to make this work. One thing we talk about, and I was talking about this earlier with some students, is the idea of what journalism is. And I think of journalism much more as a trade than as a academic profession. That I liken it in a lot of ways to fixing cars. That there is a set of instructions you could follow. There's a YouTube video that could teach you how to write a news article, right? Step 1, step 2, step 3. But that to become a master at it, you have to put in so many repetitions that you understand not just the rules, but you understand when and how to break the rules. That you understand that actually in this type of car, you really need to do this part first and that part. And you learn that through experience. And so when I think about the elements of journalism, story ideas and story selection, interviewing, writing, reporting, all of those things are things that we get so much better at each time we do them. And so I still benefit today from interviews I did in 8th grade and in high school, and from stories I did and debates I had with my high school editor, right? Because all of those things sharpen the way we think about the work that we do. So throughout college, I was convinced that what I wanted to do is I wanted to go from one place to the next. I wanted to build myself up with this experience up a ladder. And so I started at a unpaid internship at a weekly newspaper back home in Cleveland. I worked 2 days a week there, and then 40 hours a week all the other days to try to pay for tuition while also taking this unpaid internship. And I went from there to a copy editing internship in Detroit, and then a reporting internship in Columbus, and then finally a big internship at the Wall Street Journal in New York. And then finally, after school, internship at the Boston Globe, which I really wanted because the Globe had the reputation, and still does, of being one of the best internships in the country. It was a place where if you show up at the Globe for a summer, you're going to write 50 pieces. They're going to deploy you as a Metro reporter, and that was something I really desperately wanted, was to do that work. But so much of the time I spent in college and immediately after college was really focused on one thing. I had entered college in 2008 as Barack Obama was elected president. And I had watched for 4 years as the political reporters seemed to kind of have like the sexiest job in journalism. There were all these new online technologies, so they're tweeting from campaign rallies, and they're with Obama in the plane, and they're doing this thing, and they're doing that thing, and I just thought, all right, I want to get to the point that by 2016, I can cover a presidential election. That's what I really want to do. And so all of these choices I had made had been set up towards that. After I interned at the Globe, I went out to the LA Times to do a fellowship. When I was out there, I covered City Hall. I covered some local politics. I got a call from editors at the Globe. They said, come back to Boston, where I took a job working on the Metro desk, but also covering local politics, covering the city council, which at the time were people like now Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, covering the mayoral race, the end of Tom Menino's last administration, and then the election that led to the election of Marty Walsh, now the Labor Secretary. And we also happened to have, it was a big year in Massachusetts politics. A guy named John Kerry got named Secretary of State. It suddenly opened up a new Senate seat, and so some guy named Ed Markey gets elected to that. There was a Kennedy floating around in Congress talking about what he might do or might not do. There was this woman named Ayanna Pressley who had been the biggest vote getter in the city, and what might she do and where might she be going? And so there was a ton happening in the city, and my goal still was like, all right, maybe if I do this the right way, I can get to New Hampshire. And again, for whatever reason, I was just convinced that 2016, being the election after the first black president, that it was just going to be this remarkable like battle of the ideas and this like high-minded campaign. And so that was my goal, was to get to that. And so the Washington Post called the day after the mayoral race ended in Boston, and they said, you said you didn't have any time to talk to us until the race is over. Didn't it end yet last night? And I said, fair enough, it did. And I was really happy in Boston. I had no desire to leave the Globe. Like I said, it had been a remarkable team experience covering the mayor's race and then covering the marathon bombings. We had some ideas that coverage might win some big awards coming the following year, and I definitely wanted to be around to toast the champagne for that. And so I kept telling them, like, just call me later. Like, I'm really busy right now, maybe 2016. And they called me back and they said, well, you said you want to cover politics. Could we interest you in covering Congress for the Post? And when the Washington Post calls you and asks you to come to D.C. and cover Congress, you say yes to that. And so I showed up in Washington with one suit to cover Congress. I didn't really know what Congress did or how it worked. I still don't really know what Congress does or how it works or what it does. But I showed up, and I remember I used to sit next to or back to back with a buddy named Mark Arsenal at the Globe, and he had covered Congress for the Globe in Washington. And I remember him telling me, you're going to love it because you go to work in a museum every day. And it was true. My desk was in the Capitol building, and every day I walked around with the most powerful people in our democracy, asking them questions about the future of our democracy, about what was happening, about the immigration bill, about the debt ceiling, about what was going on, the function of our government. I enjoyed it. It was fun. I learned a lot. It was a time when most political reporting from Congress was about the Republican leadership fights, where was the Tea Party to run out John Boehner? Were they ever going to do immigration reform? What's going to happen here? And it was a crowded space, and so I actually spent most of my time covering the minority, the Democrats. Are they going to try to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act? What are they going to do around long-term unemployment extensions, right? And that was a space that was wide open. There weren't a lot of people covering it. But one of the things I learned pretty early on in my journalism career, it served me at the Globe, it served me at the LA Times, it certainly served me at the Post, was sometimes part of being a good reporter is weaseling your way into a story that really has nothing to do with you at all, and is not in your job description. Because good reporters want to be on the story. They want to be in it. They want to find a way to contribute. And so I remember in August 2014 watching, I was in Michigan with a congressional candidate and opening my phone and seeing tweets and Instagrams and posts from a reporter I knew, a young woman named Brittany, who was a local reporter in St. Louis, Missouri. We had worked together through the National Association of Black Journalists. We've been friends for years. And she was at the scene of a officer involved of a police shooting. It's actually a funny story. Brittany was from St. Louis. Her mother had actually been one of the first high-ranking black women in the St. Louis Police Department. And she had moved back after college to cover her local market. And it was the day of her engagement photo shoot. It was a Saturday. And so it's Brittany and her fiance, and they're next to like a waterfall or something, and there's a photographer taking the photos, and Brittany starts getting these text messages. Hey, there's been a police shooting in Ferguson. There's a thing, they think it's an unarmed black kid, we don't know what's going on, and the photographer and fiance are like, yo, get off your phone, we gotta do this thing. And she's like, no, this stuff's happening. So she calls the station she works for. She goes, we need to send someone out there. And they're like, it's a Saturday, we're short-staffed, is this really a big deal? We don't know. And Brittany, this is why she's my sister, she's kind of hard-headed like I am, wouldn't let this go. And so she keeps calling the station, and finally she turns to her fiance and goes, I gotta go. And so she abandons the waterfall and her fiance and the photographer, leaves her own engagement photo shoot, and drives to Ferguson, Missouri, and arrives around the time that Michael Brown's mother had arrived. The crowds were beginning to gather. Michael Brown's body was still on the street in Canfield Drive. And these crowds were beginning to gather, asking, what happened? Why is this young man dead? Who killed him? And so for the rest of the weekend, I followed her coverage. She was there on the ground. By the second day, by Sunday, a buddy of mine at the LA Times had shown up, and it was clear there was going to be more coverage. And then by the time we woke up Monday morning, there had been, the Quick Trip gas station had been burned down in Ferguson, and unfortunately that meant this was going to be a sustained national story. It's something to think about that, I wasn't put on the plane when Michael Brown was killed, but rather was put on the plane the morning after the gas station was burned down. But I got into the office that day and trying to find my way into this story, walked to my buddy at the national desk and said, how can I be helpful? Can I call the congressional delegation from Missouri? Maybe they have some information about what's happening in DC or if it's being monitored. And as we were having this brainstorming conversation, I'm offering myself up to do a job that is not mine. An editor happened to walk past and say, hey, are you talking about Ferguson? Can you get on an airplane? And so I went to DCA, I got on an airplane. I thought I was going to be there about 3 days, and I ended up spending about 3 months on the ground in Ferguson. And then I spent years covering issues of race, policing, and justice, and covering the kind of emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. That most cities where there's been a major police shooting or major sustained protest are cities where I've spent significant time. I remember when I first arrived, how tangible a lot of the frustration had been. I'd covered police shootings before. One of my big stories when I was at the LA Times was a police shooting. I'd covered a few police shootings here in Boston at the Globe. But there was something different. I'd covered protests. I'd been in the aftermath when people come out and say that enough is enough and this doesn't work, and then it kind of dissipates. But it was very clear from the first night in Ferguson, Missouri, that there was something different about the energy. That something really had been awakened that was going to have a sustaining power that was different. I remember interviewing folks, and that first night, I put out a tweet or something, said, "Hey, I'm going to Ferguson. Who should I talk to?" And all these people kept responding to me with the name of this woman, Janetta Elzy. Netta was a young woman who lived not far from Ferguson. We're about the same age, and she had seen the tweets about Michael Brown being killed, and she had decided to drive to see for herself what had happened. What I didn't know at the time, but know now, is that Janetta had a friend who'd been killed by the police the year prior, one of her closest friends, and she had watched and monitored the media coverage really closely. She did the thing none of us are supposed to do, and she read every comment underneath these stories about her friend who'd been killed. And she was made sick by the things people were saying. She was noting the things that felt like innuendo in the language or the means of the commenter. She had all these questions, and it didn't seem like the reporters were asking these questions. She wanted to know what happened. And for whatever reason on that day, when she saw that Michael Brown had been killed, she decided that, if I had been there when my friend Stephen had been killed, I could have talked about what happened, and they couldn't have lied about what it was. And so Michael's body's still in the street, and I'm going to be there myself, and I'm going to tweet everything I see, and that way no one can lie about what happened. They can't lie about the protests. They can't lie about the tear gas. They can't. And so Janetta became this kind of first responder community journalist. She'd been sending like thousands of tweets. And so I tweeted at her and said, hey, can you follow me back? I want to send you a message. And so I send her this message. And she'd also been really sharply critical of the local media coverage, some of which was pretty good, some of which was not so good in retrospect, right? So I sent her a note, and I still tease her about this. I say, I send her a note, and I say, look, my name's Wesley. I'm from the Washington Post. I'm getting on the plane right now. I'm going to cover this story. I want to cover it the right way. Can we talk? Can we meet up? And so she sends me, all right, this is my number. I'm going to be at this NAACP community meeting in a few hours. I'll meet you there. And I was like, awesome. I'll be the light-skinned guy in the orange sweater. Like, we'll meet up. And so Netta then proceeds to tweet, because she was live tweeting everything that happened, and now the Washington Post is coming to tell the real story about it. And I was like, Netta, I can see your tweets. Like, this is why. And she's like, all right, my bad. Like, all right. And so I get to Ferguson. I land. I go to the first press conference held by Michael Brown's family, and I see, they walk in. It's the first time anyone from the press has really seen them other than that first day at the scene. They're wearing freshly made T-shirts with his face on them. Ben Crump arrives. I knew him at the time because I had done some coverage of the Trayvon Martin case, and he had been the family attorney for them. And so he arrives, and we talk for a bit, and we sit and we listen as Michael Brown's family, as well as Ben Crump, begin making this argument that we would later, that is now so obvious as to be cliche, but at the time I remember literally making a note about the tactic of it, arguing that Michael Brown was the latest in a line of people, that there were other names, that this was a story that was not an isolated incident, but rather something that fit into a larger, bigger narrative and story about our country and race in our country. And I left there. I go to the NAACP meeting. I file my dispatches, and it's up online. And I go to this NAACP meeting, and one thing to know about me is I'm not very good at logistics. I am late to everything. I would forget my birthday if I didn't write it on my desk calendar. And so when I travel, I always am going to be late to whatever the thing is, especially if time zones are somehow involved. And so I've come from Washington. I'm now in St. Louis. We've gone from Eastern to Central time. And I show up at this NAACP meeting at this church in St. Louis, and I see like 100, 200 people standing outside. And I go, okay, all right, I'm either an hour late and it's over, or I'm an hour early and the doors are literally locked. But either way, this is fine, because if I'm an hour early, that's great. If I'm an hour late, at least they're all still here. I can talk to everybody. I can figure out what happened. So I get out of the car, I run up, I get to the door, and someone comes to the door of the church, and they say, what do you need? What do you want? And I say, oh, I wanted to see what's going on with this meeting. He goes, oh, we're already at capacity. The meeting hasn't started yet, but there are already 500 or 600 people in here. All these folks are waiting until the meeting's over so the people coming outside can explain to them if any new information about the Michael Brown case was shared. And I'm sitting here thinking, this is one of the first moments where I'm just thinking about how different this is. I'd covered community meetings where it was me and one other guy sitting in the audience. I'd covered community forums where there was almost no one. Here we were, it was 100.5 degrees outside in August in St. Louis. This church was filled to capacity, and there were well over 100 people standing in the asphalt waiting for hours for any kernel of information about what had happened. So I start interviewing people, and I send Janetta another message, and she finally comes and finds me, and she goes, you didn't tell me you were going to be this light-skinned. And I was like, thank you, Janetta, for that. And so she's like, we already have a friend named White West. We'll call you 0.5 West. And I was like, fine. This is like, fine. And so, which she's still, I think I'm still saved in her phone today as 0.5 West. But I say, Janetta, get in the car with me. I want to go back into Ferguson. I want you to show me where the violence was last night, where the protests were, where Michael Brown was done. I want you to be my fixer. Come with me, I'll drive around, let's figure this out. And so we go in, and she shows me the buildings that had been damaged the night before, and she shows me the places where the clashes had been, and then we get to Canfield Drive where Michael Brown had been killed, and we see the little memorial for him, and we're around the corner as the police and the protesters begin clashing yet again for what is the third night. And as I'm interviewing a homeowner, a tear gas canister lands near us, and thus begins that night. It was a night of a lot of tear gas and rubber bullets and chaos in the streets of Ferguson. And I remember as I would interview people, that night and those nights moving forward, I would ask them, questions that sound almost naive. How would you describe the relationship between the black community and the police here in Ferguson? Do you think there are, there's these questions that were kind of framed in these ways that now feel very obvious, but were the questions to ask. And I would hear these stories, and I remember hearing story after story that were just some of the craziest anecdotes I'd ever heard. I was hearing stories about people going to parks and having police dogs sicked on them, right? I was hearing stories I remember, I'll never forget this man, as we're getting tear gas, is telling me this story of his father having a heart attack, and instead of them sending an ambulance, they sent a police car, and they handcuffed the father to take him to the hospital. And I just remember writing all these things down and thinking, I'm never going to be able to prove any of these anecdotes. I'm not going to be able to get any of these in the Washington Post. I had a skepticism of them. They all seemed too, they were not unbelievable. I believed them, but how was I ever going to prove them? How was I ever going to qualify these experiences? So I kind of let those notebooks sit there. I was writing, I was doing work, and I let those notebooks sit there. But as Ferguson kept progressing, I remember we were filing all these stories, all these dispatches from there. And one thing that would happen time and time again is I would do these man-on-the-street interviews. I would talk to activists, to civil rights folks, to attorneys for Michael Brown's family, and to the witnesses, and to talk to just the normal residents. And they would go, there's an epidemic happening, that black men are being gunned down the streets every single day, and no one's being held accountable, and no one's stopping it. Being a good reporter, I would call the police and the police spokesperson and the union, and they would say, hold on, we don't ever kill any black people. We definitely don't kill any unarmed black people. And if we do, they kind of had it coming anyway because they deserved it. And so I'd write my little story up. And eventually, smart editors and I had this conversation where which one of those things was true? Because they couldn't both be true. Either this thing was happening every day or it was not. That this entire conversation about police violence was happening without any context of how frequently this police violence occurs. How do we decide if something is an outlier incident or the daily heartbeat of American life if we don't know how frequently the thing happens? So we start calling around, again with the naivete of 2014. I call the Ferguson police station and say, how many unarmed black people have you all killed? And they don't return the phone call. We call the Missouri Secretary of State and we say, how many unarmed black people have been killed in Missouri in the last 5 years? And they go, we don't count that. What are you talking about? Now we're the Washington Post. So we go, we're gonna go to Eric Holder. The Department of Justice is gonna tell us this. And so we march down to DOJ and file all these FOIAs. And finally the statistician from DOJ calls me back and he goes, look, I have a number of how many people the police have killed. But the number is so inaccurate that if you use this number, I want you to quote me on the record saying I told you not to. I was like, well, this is a first. I don't think I've ever had this response. So what's going on here? So we begin reporting on this and looking into this further. And I ended up writing a piece in October 2014 about the lack of data in the United States of America as it relates to the people who are killed by the police. That in a time, 2014 is now almost a decade ago, but even back then, it's a very high-tech, data and analytics-driven society and culture we lived in. We knew how many people had seen the latest movie and how many of them had gotten popcorn. We knew how many barrels of corn there were in Iowa, how many shark attacks there had been, but we didn't know how many people, taxpayer-funded police officers carrying taxpayer-funded guns, had shot and killed a taxpayer in the last year. It seemed very odd. As it turned out, the extent the federal government had any data, it was a voluntary self-report. Once every year, they would, have a nice phone call, send a nice email to the 19,000 police departments in the country and say, hey, how many people did you kill? Could you please respond? And predictably, the vast majority of the departments did not respond. According to the federal data, there had never been a police killing in the history of the state of Florida. The New York police never killed anyone, according to the federal data. Eric Gardner wasn't killed by the police, according to the federal data. Tamir Rice was not killed by the police, according to the federal data. Michael Brown in Ferguson was not killed by the police, according to the federal data. But what we figured out as we did this reporting, was there was a way to start figuring this out. That there had been some efforts and some attempts previously to kind of get at this data. you couldn't do it in some of the traditional ways we think of it. You couldn't send a bunch of FOIA requests. The reason you couldn't is because there were 19,000 police departments. It would take you 4 years to send them all off. It would take you 4 more years to do any follow-up with them. And some of these, and in some cases, and there are entire states that would not have to comply with your request for record. You'd never actually get to it. So we couldn't do it that way. But what we learned was that, especially for police shootings, because of the role that guns play in our culture and the dialogue we have around gun violence. If someone is shot and killed by a police officer, no matter the market, in the smallest place in the country and the biggest place in the country, at least one reporter writes it down one time. One reporter stands there at the crime scene tape and does a hit for the news at noon. One reporter writes a brief for the newspaper. And so we figured out, and this was really pioneered by my colleagues Julie Tate and Jennifer Jenkins, we figured out that we could essentially set up an elaborate system of Google alerts. And it would tell us every time someone had gotten shot and killed by the police. And then we could follow up. We could call and get their name, and we could figure out what happened, and we could start filling out an Excel sheet with all these pieces of information, and we'll figure out what happened. At the time, that number the FBI told me not to use. According to the FBI's number, there had never been more than 462 fatal police shootings in a year in the United States. And so we're thinking if we get to 500 in a year, we find 50 cases where the government killed someone and it's not in the records, that's a pretty major story. It's gonna be a nice front page Washington Post piece. We start doing this tracking, and by May, we're already at 500 for the year. We ultimately, in that first year, end up recording 993 fatal police shootings in 2015. So the police were killing people at more than double the rate that any of our statistics would show. What we also found, because were collecting this, is we were able to now analyze this data. We were able to try to figure out what leads to a fatal police shooting. We're having all this conversation about what people need to do and not need to do and what the police need to do and what they don't, but all of it was absent. I remember a woman who at the time was the Attorney General of California and is now the Vice President telling me, she said that all this conversation is happening based on emotion and anecdote and absent real information. And she, for some legitimate critiques of her time on criminal justice, she did do a lot of data collection in California around these issues for that reason, that you can't solve a problem you can't actually see or measure or quantify. And so we began seeing these remarkable trends in the data. One, we were genuinely, I was a little less surprised than some of my colleagues, but we were collectively generally surprised by the frequency of these police shootings. That every single day in America, the police shoot and kill 3 people. That is true across seasons, it's true across years. The pandemic didn't change that at all. Every day in America, about 3 people are shot and killed by a police officer. The vast majority of those people are armed white men, which was something that was a little surprising initially, although when you start looking at the demographics of the country, there are in fact tens of millions more white people than there are anyone else. And so that did make sense. That at least 1 in 3, but maybe as many as half of the people killed by the police are in the midst of a mental health or drug and alcohol crisis. And it spoke to how police were being used as first responders for any number of incidents that there are reasonable arguments to be made should not be done by men with guns. And that we also found that Black Americans were deeply disproportionately represented in the people killed by police. That while Black Americans make up 12% of the population, they make up 24% of the people shot and killed by the police and 40% of the unarmed people killed by the police. That an unarmed Black person is killed about every 8 days in America. Well, for a relatively small community, that does feel like a thing that's happening every day. That the people who had taken to the streets weren't making it up. That their experience was reflected in this data we now collected. And so, and I'm gonna wrap this and then we can take questions, but the project Fatal Force was a success and it's ongoing. It remains the definitive place to find real-time information on police use of force, and the team at the Post still does remarkable work with it. We won lots of awards, which was really exciting, and everyone said we were really smart and did a lot of really good journalism, and that was cool. But one thing that bothered me as I thought about it was, I remembered as we were celebrating Fatal Force, a series of reports came out from the Department of Justice. The first was an investigation into the shooting of Michael Brown itself, in which they decided they weren't going to charge Officer Darren Wilson. The second was a report on the patterns and practices of the police department, on the experience that Black Americans were having in Ferguson and in North County, St. Louis. And in this report, the Department of Justice investigators detail these remarkable civil rights abuses. Stories of people going to parks and having dogs sicked on them. Stories of people calling 911 for an ambulance and getting a police cruiser instead. Stories of children being tased for no reason. And as I read this report, I couldn't help but think to all of the stories that were still in my notebook. I had these stories. And yet none of them had ever made it, for all the stories I'd written about Ferguson, Missouri, none of those stories had ever made it into the newspaper. And it was a moment for me that I think is really important. I think it's important for us to be self-critical, to be introspective. I think it's important for us to be willing and able to critique our own journalism so that we can do better journalism the next day. And I had no way of explaining the decision-making that I had made other than to think that I funded, for whatever reason, even as a young Black man who was willing to believe all types of things about the police might be capable of doing or not, I was still unwilling to fully believe some of these stories I was hearing. People were giving me on-the-record accounts, and for whatever reason, I didn't think I would be able to prove it. I didn't think I'd be able to get it past an editor. I didn't think, I just had enough doubt and enough skepticism. And so, you know, I used to think about our job as journalists as giving, you know, voice to the voiceless and that type of thing. And I remember one of the activists I talked to a lot correcting me one day and noting that, you know, there are no voiceless people, but there are people who are unheard. And I think about those people in Ferguson who'd given me their stories, and yet I wasn't able to hear them, and my audience never got the opportunity to. And so I think when we think about what our role is, when we think about whose stories we tell, and who the storytellers are, and what precludes or includes someone in that ability, I think we have to think really hard about the diversity and complexity of the country we live in and the world we live in. We have to think really hard about historically who the storytellers have been and who they have not been. And that when we build guardrails, when we build rules, and when we establish values, we have to think about whose stories we are roping into our journalism and whose stories we're excluding out from our journalism. And so much of the work that I've done in the years since then, and also my thoughts about this industry and how we do the jobs we do, come from those experiences in the street of Ferguson. Not necessarily just the victories, but as much as anything else, from the moments that I'm not the most proud of. And so that's kind of what I think about in how I go out doing my journalism. I'm going to shut up for a second and then go sit in one of those chairs, and then we're all going to talk, and it's going to be way more fun than anything I just said. But thank you guys for being here and for your interest in journalism and for the work you guys do and the work you are all going to do, because someone in this room, I'm going to need to beg for a job one day. And so remember that I was nice to you. And I'm really looking forward to, being in conversation with you all. I can't really answer questions, but I can talk. So thank you guys. There we go.
Okay. If you have a question for Wes, please line up over there where Nia's holding the microphone, and then we'll take your questions. Let me just start out before we take the first one. If you could talk a little bit about the op-ed you wrote and kind of how it came about, but also the reaction to it.
Sure. Last year when George Floyd was killed, I've been on the Black Death beat since 2014, since I got sent to Ferguson. I've spent time in most of the places where there have been significant unrest, uprisings of people, significant police shootings, significant cases. And when George Floyd was killed, it was remarkable to me some of the response to his death. I say that because, not that I'm necessarily a cynic, but because it's my job to cover these things. I don't think I watched the George Floyd video for the first few days because I wasn't necessarily convinced this would be the one. And I have had to come into the practice of not watching every video that comes across my desk or into my email account because I would spend all day watching videos of people being killed by the police. And so by day 3 or day 4, when there was a staying power, I finally watched and started making phone calls and eventually went to Minneapolis. But I remember as I was doing that reporting, it's also very odd to be one of the people who people call in the midst of these like crises, to have some weird expertise on when the police kill black people and then have everyone call you in response to the police killing black people. I was working on a piece for The Atlantic, and I was doing some work with 60 Minutes, some reporting on the ground. I was spending time with, I spent time with George Floyd's family and attended the funeral with them, and still pretty close with his brother. But I remember the conversations that were playing out in the weeks and months following George Floyd's death about these issues within the media itself, about how we cover such issues, about who we provide platform to and who we do not, about who occupies our newsrooms and who does not. And in particular, there had been a lot of blowback to the decision the New York Times made to publish an op-ed from Tom Cotton advocating that the National Guard be sent in to clear out the protesters. The black staff members at the Times, many of whom were dear friends of mine, argued in their statement that the piece did not meet time standards. It had several factual inaccuracies in it. Its tone did not quite meet the seriousness of the moment. Essentially, that it was a remarkably inflammatory piece that was remarkably insensitive in a remarkably touchy moment, and that there were implications to that. This became a 9/11 level event in journalism. The opinion editor of the New York Times ends up getting fired over this. There's some rearranging and whatnot. There's a lot of gnashing of teeth about how the New York Times staff is against free speech and X, Y, and Z and all these things. And as that was happening, they were soliciting pieces about what had happened and about this conversation broadly. And I know a number of editors over there. And someone had reached out to me and asked me about it. I had been pretty outspoken in support of the black staff members at the Times, and had been talking to a lot of them about what was going on. And I, if I remember correctly, kind of counterpitched and said, well, I don't really want to write about the Tom Cotton op-ed, but I do think this fits within a broader and bigger framework of a discussion that's happening in our industry right now. And that fundamentally, the things that are playing out and the tensions we're seeing are still the birth pains of integration in media. That essentially what happened here is a set of decision makers made a decision that was deeply offensive to black staff members, and those black staff perspectives were not included on the front end. And now other people are trying to figure out why they don't understand why the black people are mad, and that this is in many ways about the persistent failure of mainstream journalism to fully integrate. And so I wrote that piece, and as part of that piece, I talked a lot about how the toll that falls on black staff members who are in these majority white spaces, particularly around their personal expression, their perceived politics, or their advocacy for journalism, or for diversity in journalism. This was a time where a young woman had been fired had been told at the Pittsburgh paper, had been told she couldn't cover the Black Lives Matter protest because she had made a joke about how people riot at country concerts. And that made her unobjective to cover the biggest news story of the time that was happening. And I wrote about how too often, especially on issues of race, we are governed by the appearance of objectivity. And I draw a distinction there between what actual objectivity is, right? I think actual objectivity is not about person, it's about process. No journalist is objective because no person is objective. We all have biases, we all have life experiences that color how we see the world we live in. We walk past someone on the street and we think they're attractive or we think they're ugly, right? This isn't a decision we made. It is our subjective, the way we see the world. And by the way, that's not locked in stone. It can change when presented with additional evidence or additional experience. But we all bring who we are to everything we do. What can be objective is a process. Have we reached out to all the people involved? Have we sought out all of the facts? Are we telling the truth about what has happened? But too often, and so often on issues of race, we're not, in fact, employing an objectivity of process. What we're doing is we are taking cases where the truth is clear. That when a powerful person tells a series of elected officials who are women of color to go back to where they came from, that is racist, definitionally. And when we decide not to use that word, we are not making an objective decision. This is not objective journalism. We are making a decision to appease the biases of our white readership, because we know they won't like that word. And that we are working, that is our job to tell objective truths, or is our job to be perceived as objective by people who may not like objective truths? The sky is blue. To write the sky is blue is to write an objective truth. But if half of the country thinks the sky is orange, they might not perceive us as objective if we write that the sky is blue. So what is our job as journalists? Do we say, well, some say the sky is blue, or do we say the sky is blue and say, screw it to the 50% who want to say the sky is orange? And on some issues, I don't think we struggle on that. But on issues of race particularly, I think we have we just have a real issue with offending the potential sensibilities of our white readers. And what I would say, and what I would know, and then I'll shut up, I answered this question way too long. But what I would say is, I remember having this conversation with an editor once, because we talk about, sometimes in journalism, we talk about, on race, let's show and not tell, right? Go out on the assignment, and hopefully the person who you think is a racist will do like a remarkably ironic racist thing right in front of you, and then you can just write that down, and you never actually have to say what they did or how they didn't do it, right? And look, as someone who writes for a living, show not tell is a remarkable writing device, but it is not actually a tenet of journalism. As anyone who's done investigative reporting, because show not tell is a remarkable argument against nut graphs. When we do reporting, we say what we have concluded. But for some reason on this issue, no, we're not allowed to say that. We're not allowed to say what is true. We're not allowed to say what is real. And I think we have to complicate and think about that. And we have to think about why. We have to think about who we're protecting and whose trust we're prioritizing. I remember saying this to an editor, and she was saying, well, why can't we just, and I said, I have a grandmother, a black grandmother, who has been alive, who for more of the time that she's been alive than not, she was unable to vote in this country. If something objectively racist happens and I refuse to call it racist, is that going to make her trust me? Of course it's not. If a journalist is unwilling to tell me the sky is blue, then I don't trust anything they say. And I get, while on issues like this, there are moments and places where there are nuances and complications. It's important to be judicious in our language and to be fair to the people we write about. But when time after time after time after time, we see obvious things not being called by their name, it becomes a moral question about our ability as the Fourth Estate to do the job we're supposed to do. That racism is wrong, and we need to have the moral clarity to say that racism is wrong. And I think, and that was what I wrote, I think a little less elegantly than that, and then everyone got mad at me, and we still talk about it.
Okay, so let's start with the questions.
Thank you so much for all of this. I've been sitting here saying, yes, amen. And I know the students are on me looking at me like people don't do call and response here, I guess. My name is Dr. Regine Jonchal. I'm new on the faculty here at Northeastern. I have a question. I was so happy when you brought up Brittany Packnett-Cunningham. I adore her. I had the pleasure of being in conversation with her a couple of years ago, and she was so unequivocal about her formation as a student of Black studies and African American history. And she talked about how it influenced her trajectory, her activism, her writing, just everything that she does. And so I wanted to know for you, and I say this, I should disclose, I'm also director of Africana Studies here, and I've been thinking about how we can collaborate with CAMD specifically. So I wanted to know for you, what does that mean when you think about Black studies in terms of your thinking, or you think about, just whether it's like going back to Ida B. Wells, we all like that for the journalism examples, but what are some ways in which African American history or Black studies globally have influenced your thinking and your trajectory?
Of course, it's a really good question. Brittany Packnett-Cunningham and her husband Reggie are dear friends. They used to be my neighbors. They used to live across the street from me, and so then they moved to a big fancy house. But one of the things I think about a lot is the role of the black press historically, and the necessity of the black press historically. We do live in a world where the mainstream press is ostensibly integrated. Again, the numbers might suggest a different reality, but we do not have segregated newsrooms, right? That the goal of your local paper is ostensibly to cover the entirety of its readership without regard for race or ethnicity or background. And up until the mid-'60s, that just was not true. Like, objectively, that was not their goal. It was for and by white people. And as I think about the struggles of integration in some of these debates, right? The pushback of when black reporters speak out at these things, are they becoming activists instead of journalists? Or how do you balance these things? How do we think about them? I do think that my thinking on it is informed very directly by my understanding of the history of the black press. Yeah. The black press is created to push back on the failures of the white press to begin with, right? That there was always a counterbalancing and there was always some opposition there. And if the white press had done its job, there wouldn't have been the need for such a thing, but there is a need for such a thing. And so when I think about the role of black journalists, I often think about whether it's inside the institutions we work for or within the industry at large, we often have played the role of ombudsmen of sorts around these issues and forcing and prodding and pushing the rest of the industry into spaces it might not otherwise be comfortable in, both through our work and then also sometimes through the things we say. Yeah. And I think that so I think about that, but then I also think about the role of the black journalist in seeing and telling stories that other people are unwilling to see and to tell. One might describe that as activism. I'm not sure that that's fair. I'm not sure that that's true, right? And I also, by the way, I have a much more complicated view of what I think journalism and activism are. I think that good journalism often is an act of activism in favor in favor of the truth, in favor of transparency, you're releasing a thing that someone else might not want released. Well, that's not particularly neutral. You're exposing a thing that a powerful person might not want exposed, right? That there's some overlap there. And especially in a time when telling the truth is a political act, to tell the truth is a political act. And so I think about Ida B. Wells, right? I have a buddy at the National Archives, and he sent me I have it above my desk, and it's the map that she submitted to Congress in favor of one of the anti-lynching bills that failed, where she had personally counted the lynchings in all of these states, and she had made the map that she filed to try to prove this thing that had been true, that she was in many ways one of the founding mothers of data journalism. Her body of work, her life's work was counting lynchings and analyzing them to prove that they existed and were happening, and to disprove the racist trope that all of them were happening because these black men couldn't help but rape white women, and so we just had to murder them. And it was journalism. Anyone in the country could have done it, but it fell to her because no one else was willing to. No one else was willing to believe this thing could be true. I think about the journalism done by the civil rights photographers and many of the civil rights reporters in covering these issues across both the South and the North that had always been there. Anyone could have written about these things, but for whatever reason they didn't. I think about today's press corps and the set of journalists who have covered these issues around policing, around justice, around racial disparities. And I think back to Ferguson a lot. I remember following the coverage that arose after Ferguson and seeing a lot of great coverage. I remember specifically a really good piece in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch about diversity levels in all the various police jurisdictions in the entire area, and it's probably published in October or November. And one of the things I think is that all of those stories, all that great journalism, my own included, could have been done the day before Michael Brown was killed. But it wasn't. And so when you're covering something
that has not necessarily been explored before, when you're exposing a truth that might make some people uncomfortable, you are almost always going to receive a backlash from those who don't want to believe the thing to be true. But we look back, I was talking to some students earlier, we look back at some of the journalism we did at the Post in 14 and 15 and 16, that there were some people who were literally ready to like hang me up, right? We were activists and we were crusading and I hated all the cops and all. And if you read this today in a post-George Floyd context, this is the most mild and tempered and fair reporting on this issue that anyone was doing. We just had the audacity to ask questions other people weren't ready to ask. And so I think that for me, in the moments of that type of backlash, can steel myself in thinking, is it more important to be popular or is it more important to be right? Do I want 100 years from now, my grandchildren to, like Ida B. Wells' grandchildren, be accepting a Pulitzer on her behalf because she's the only journalist who had the audacity to report on the American horror of lynching? The Klan burned her newspaper to the ground. They threatened her life. She was on the run for most of the end of her life. Now, I don't face anything like that. But the tradition of black journalism is that you do the work the other journalism won't do, and hopefully history remembers that you did it. And that might not be immediate, but I think that for me, and I know some of the other prominent black journalists in this space, I know that's the type of thing we talk to each other about a lot. That was a very long answer, I'm sorry.
Can you, thank you. Can you hand it to the next person? Go ahead.
I'm not gonna lie, I thought you were a student, and I was gonna be really happy that I wasn't the first student up here, but here we are. Hi, my name is Pavitra Rajesh. I'm a third-year journalism major here, and I'm currently on co-op at the Christian Science Monitor right on Mass Ave. So my question is, and so what I've noticed a lot of times in conversations when I'm talking about the news or pitching stories is I very naturally look at the race angle in a lot of these stories. And now that's not because I'm searching for the race angle. That's just because the way I was raised as a woman of color in about 7 different countries moving around. So that's just the way I look at things.
Yes.
But a lot of the times I largely find in conversation with my largely American and white colleagues that when I bring up stories like that or topics like that, they kind of look at me at this lens of like, oh, there she is, the journalist of color, bringing up the race angle again. And so sometimes that makes me hesitate to bring up those stories because I don't, especially as a student and someone who's just working their way up, I don't want to be cornered as like, yeah, you're the person who brings up the race stories and you'll cover these stories and that's it. But I struggle with that because I also know that I want to talk about these topics and that they're very visible in every single story I cover. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, any advice you have about how to navigate that, just realistically speaking, I guess.
I think it's a really, really good question, and I think it is one that, you know, I don't know how good my advice will be because I dispositionally just pitch the story anyway. Like, I mean, they're gonna run me out one day for doing too much race stuff, right? But like, that's what I will have done, right? I will always be the guy who's like, well, what about the race angle? That's me. That's what I do.
You can teach here afterwards.
But what I will say is, and I speak because I know it the best, most often from the history of black journalism, but I do think a lot of it is applicable more largely as we talk about other groups that have made their ways into newsrooms and have historically been excluded. It's just the history I know. This has actually been a conversation that has happened cyclically throughout. Again, if the history of black journalists in white newsrooms begins in 68-ish, for that entire time, there has been a conversation within black journalism about what is our role in these spaces and how do we navigate it. And that type of thinking shifts generation over generation. I'm working on a piece now that's looking at the history of black journalists in the newspaper and talking to these journalists from all these different generations and how they thought about their role and how that changed from the 70s to the 80s to the 90s to the 2000s. That I remember when I was coming up, still coming up, right? But I remember when I was younger, and you know, and it was people like me and Michelle Cinder and kind of a set of young black journalists, and we're all friends going back to all those years. A lot of our mentors would say they had spent their careers not wanting to be seen as the black journalist. that they wanted to be able to prove they could cover anything. They didn't want to be put on the inner city beat and then like maybe get to, like, that they labored to get to be a business reporter and I get that. And so I would get questions all the time from journalists 10 years older than me, 20 years older than me. Like, are you worried about getting typecast or getting thrust in this thing and only being, and the response, and I mean, Misha and I talk about this over drinks all the time, like, where we were both like, what other story would we ever cover? We were of the post-Obama Trayvon Martin generation. There's no, if that's what's happening right now, that's where I want to be. I have no desire to cover any other thing. And again, and I always say part of that to me is about, I mean, the story of America is like the never-ending reckoning for the original son of slavery, right? And like colonialism and all that. Like, it's like, this is like basically the broad story if you zoom all the way out. What other story would I ever want to cover? It's the most important story in the history of our civilization, right? And I get that not everyone sees it that way or thinks about that. One of the other things I'll say though is I do really, as much as I have, for better or worse, gained like some following or acclaim for this type of coverage, it's been really important to me in the places I've worked to be able to do all types of different types of journalism. That, you know, I didn't, again, I kind of started in politics. I've done a lot of Metro stuff. I, even post-Pulitzer, would come in and volunteer to help with mass shootings, and because I thought it was important for me to keep all of my tools sharp. I've been doing I just did a Will Smith cover story for GQ, right? Which like isn't not about race, but isn't like me on the cops killing people. You know, like it's a different, like, because I think that's important, right? Because I think that storytelling is a craft and journalism is a craft, and I think we want to be sharp in all these places. I can write you a business story. Give me the assignment. I can write you a celebrity profile. I can write a great sports piece, right? And I think that curiosity, for me, I've never been ashamed to run at what I think is an important story. And if the important story is race or ethnicity or whatever, then that's the story we should do. Because I also understand that my colleague sitting next to me might not have that perspective. That I am the one with the pigment here, and so I might be the one thinking that. And that's fine. So let me be the one to say it. And it's unfortunate that burden might fall that way. I don't think that's how it would be in an ideal world. But that's important. And meanwhile, I've always tried to focus on also making sure that I am doing all of the work in all the other places. And so that my value can never be reduced to like, oh, he's the race guy, he does the race stuff. You know, I think probably the most read thing I ever wrote was a piece after the Las Vegas mass shooting, where race was not really an element of the piece at all. It was just a feature, you know? And so I think that is something I've always thought about. Thank you. Of course.
Hi, I'm Antonia Sosa. I'm also a journalism major, transfer student, so I couldn't tell you what year. So I just want to know how you would describe almost like how you cope with or navigate through writing such emotionally tolling and difficult stories, and if you have any advice on that.
Not well. What I'll say is it's been, ever since I've been kind of on this beat or in this space, I get asked this question every single time I talk to students, and I think that's actually very encouraging to me, because when I was a student, I wouldn't have even thought to ask such a question. And I think it speaks to how the rising generation of journalists, but also just the rising generation of humans, think about yourselves holistically and about how you relate to the work you do and the sacrifices you make and your awareness about mental health and all that. And like I said, I'm not that far from where you all are, but that wasn't necessarily true of us when we were your age, right? I think that's like a massive amount of progress in terms of like health. You know, I think for me, there's a few things. So I mentioned earlier, despite being like the guy who writes about police shootings, I don't watch police shooting videos until I'm writing about, unless I'm writing about that video, I don't watch it. And even when I was at the Post, when it was literally my job, I would often like find the white guy and make them do it, right? Like there's you know, that I didn't need to watch. I don't need to watch Philando Castile. One thing that is interesting, and this is like a little trick of the trade or tool of the trade, when you cover such a video, one of the things we found that was remarkably successful, and so we did it, and again, I would make someone else do it, is your initial piece should include basically a rough, if not transcript, an actual factual account of what happens in the video. Because most people visiting don't actually want to watch the video. So it shows this happening, and then it shows this happening, and then you hear him say this, and it's 200 or 300 words. And you're embedding the video in there. They can watch, you're not concealing it. But like the basic, like the average person might not want to watch the video, but might want to know what's in the video that everyone's talking about it. And so something as simple as that, I think is, and you can get the visceral, you understand what happened without having to subject yourself to watching a video of someone being killed, which should not make anyone comfortable, no matter the circumstances, right? I don't watch a lot of videos. Again, if I'm writing about one specifically, I will consume it. I think sometimes when you do a job, when you have a beat that you feel is like a life's work or you feel personally passionate about, there can be this desire to feel like you have to tell every story. And I had to like disabuse myself of that very quickly. I could not write about every police shooting. I could not get jealous when ProPublica did a smart thing. I could not get mad at myself when the time, And I believe fundamentally in what I call kind of a mosaic theory of journalism, right? There's an old school set of thinking where I am the journalist, I am here to get the story, I will do it definitively. Now, to be clear, I would never argue against rigor, right? I've worked on investigative, like I call everyone, I try to get everything. But I also accept, like foundationally, fundamentally, that there might be someone who does not want to talk to me, but will talk to a different reporter, right? And so I'll get the 90% of the piece I can get, and do the due diligence, and there might be additional details that come out afterwards, and that's actually a good thing because the public now has the entirety of the story. That I would go to these stories, I'm in Ferguson, and I'm not competing with my buddy Matt Pierce of the LA Times. I want him to do a great story on that angle so I can go focus on this other angle. And then you staple our stories together, and it tells you a bigger story. And so for me, I had to come to peace with, I'm not gonna do all the things. I can't be jealous of other people's great journalism and great work. I should champion it. And I think the other thing is like being willing and being able to turn it off. And I think that that's important, like being able to step away and to disengage. Like I said, until I was going to be on the ground in Minneapolis for George Floyd, I was not sitting at my house watching CNN about the protest. And I know at times there's like almost like a guilt about, like I should be watching, I should be paying. And I had to come to peace with like, I pay my debt in this somewhere along the line. My emotional thing here will be when I'm sitting with George Floyd's family at the funeral. I don't need to be guilt watching CNN about it, right? And so having that space and that separation. The other thing I'll say is these relationships and covering stories like this, right? You're in close proximity to traumatized people, right? My sources are the moms of a bunch of dead kids. That's who's calling me at midnight, upset about a thing, or that's who's, and so there's a level of work that goes into maintaining those relationships that can be, and so I had to learn, and it's, you kind of make it up as you go, but I had to learn the boundaries in those relationships and how close to get and how not close to get and how many of those midnight calls to answer and at what point you have to like not answer that call because it can't, I had to figure out how to be very upfront. Which I think we should all be in general, but being very specific. Do you understand the stakes of what we are doing? This is going to appear this way. I'm quoting you in this. All of those things. Again, I think all of those things make you a better journalist, but they come with emotional stakes that's pretty high. It's not the state senator who's kind of mad at me. It's this mother who showed me all the baby pictures of her dead son. Right. That's gonna, like, as a human, that's gonna sit on me if she feels like I've done her wrong. Right. And so, again, when I pour myself into a thing, I've got to be all in the thing and conscious about that. And then when I'm stepping out, I got to step out of it. And so I think that's a big part of it as well, right? That there is a toll that's being so close to trauma so often, and that we have to be aware of that. It can't just be on to the next one. It's, all right, now let me go talk to Will Smith. Right, and now let me go do this other thing, and now let me take a vacation, or now let me work on a different, so it's just not the same churn over and over again, and actually taking time to process it. And frankly, I think not working for a daily paper has been helpful for me because it's not, okay, what's the next one today? It's, I can exhale, or I can work on this thing and then not work on it for a weekend, and then pick it up again, right? As opposed to how quickly can I turn this thing and get it in, and it can be very hard to cover these types of things in that environment.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, so if you can just pass the mic. Yeah.
If like 2 or 3 of you want to ask your question, and then I promise to not take forever. Like,
Oh,
so if you
okay.
just want to
Why don't we
pass
do
the
that?
mic a few,
Great.
and then I'll.
We'll package them.
Yeah, like load them in.
Yeah. Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Dakota. I'm a first-year journalism and poli-sci student. The question I kind of wanted to ask, you touched on this a bit in your speech, but also like in They Can't Kill Us, you talk about like how to like gain trust with like people you're talking about who may not necessarily have the most trust in like the news. And you talked a little bit about this like in one of the questions you answered about how like one of the ways to do that is to like be honest and tell the truth and not like hide behind like reports and stuff like that and like tell people what is accurate. But I guess I just wanted to know other ways to like get people to like open up to you, because I feel like right now we are in an era where people don't exactly trust the news as much as they may have used to. And I think like being able to get people to open up to you, especially those who are involved in like really important moments in like our society, whether that's like a protest or like, some sort of like event, I think like is really important. So, yeah.
Great.
And thanks for coming. I'm Jessie from Media Advocacy Program. And my first question is, when you've mentioned that journalists sometimes need rule breaking. So what is your most unforgettable rule breaking experience? And journalists also a storyteller. So what are your favorite storytelling methods? Thank you.
Great. And one more. Then you can answer.
Hi, my name's Katie. I'm a second-year journalism student here, and I was just wondering that I think it's natural for issues of race to come to the forefront of the news cycle when tragedy strikes. But how do you think we can keep both news consumers and journalists interested in that conversation during lulls?
That's a great question. All those are great questions. All right, so before I start, I'm going to remind you all again, thank you so much for having me. It's been really great. These have been great questions. It was a great conversation. I was telling people earlier that as one of the more public young people of journalism, this is always very refreshing to me to figure out what the young people actually think and are saying, so that I can take all of your smart things and then act like I thought of them. So I appreciate all of that. Like I said earlier, I really do want to be a resource however I can, and so like I said, feel free to follow me on Instagram and see my dog and send me a message if you need anything, or my email addresses are very easy to find through a group of young journalists, but like however I can be helpful, seriously don't hesitate, let me know how I can be helpful. Let's see if I remember the questions. The first is about trust and how we get people to trust us, especially people who might not be inclined to. I think it looks a little bit different for each of us, but I think it's where we lean into our individuality as people, as humans, right? That each of us is charming in our own way. Each of us has an appeal to ourselves. And what we're doing in an interview is we're connecting with the person and we're getting them to trust us and talk to us. One of the things I always, and it can be both good things and like not necessarily good things. What I mean by that is I always joke, one of the reasons I do really well in Black communities across the country, I've reported from most of them, is that I show up in your neighborhood and everyone's like, who is this light-skinned guy who's not from here? What's he doing? Is he lost? And then I knock on your mom's door and she's like, why are you bumbling and silly? Come in and get some food. And before long, I'm looking at the pictures and she's telling me the stories and she's pulled out her address book. Well, you need to call so-and-so and you need to do this. And now I know everything about the entire community, right? But it's because I show up in a space and I look a certain way, and like people might feel a little bad for me, they might like me, like, oh, aren't you that guy from the news, aren't you? But I use that, right? It's like we have our, and I know that there are some doors that will be answered for me and doors where I should send a colleague and it might get answered for them, right? And so we're looking for those moments. What I think more transferably across the board than like do what works for you, because that's kind of obvious advice, right? More transferably, I see interviews as conversations. In some ways, I see interviews more like dates than job interviews. That I walk away from this interaction and you're going to know as much about me as I know about you. Because if you show up at my house and ask me about all my secrets and I don't even like really know anything about you, I'm not going to trust you very much. And so there's an ability to, because the thing about active listening is it shows people that you're listening, that you're searching, you're trying to understand what they're actually saying. Whether you think they're the villain or the hero, there's something very different about probing and listening and leaning forward and asking follow-ups and saying, but so what you're saying is, and then rephrasing what they're saying. And that's very different than sitting there and going, so why did you kill the kid? Okay. How long did you work at the police department? And so I think that there's a, with fatal force, I've called every police officer in America who has shot and killed someone in the last, 2015 and 2016. I haven't talked to a lot of them, but I've talked to some of them. I've interviewed a fair number of them, many of them on the record, right? And people would always assume that because I covered some of the movement and the activists that I didn't have police, so I talk to cops all day, every day. They all like me. Because I sit there and listen to what they have to say. Now, I write what I write, and write it how I write it, and I'm not unwilling to ask them hard questions. But also, you get a better answer from the police chief when your first few questions are about, well, tell me how you got into this, and how long have you run it, and what are the challenges of the department, versus when your first question is, why did the guy kill the unarmed black kid last night? Now, I'm going to get to that question. But but by the time I ask it, I want to actually think I'm going to get an answer from him. And so we ease into it. Much like on a date, you don't start with, so where are you going after this? It's not question one. You're college students, I can say that, right? You build your way there. It's not and so you think about it, you build some rapport, and you find some common ground, and you tell some stories and some anecdotes, and then maybe, depending, and so again, building rapport and relationship is the same with any human interaction, right? The second question, if I remember correctly, was favorite times I've broken the rules, and I can't even answer that because I've broken there's too many of those. A favorite storytelling, I
did want to, I think it's a great question in part because you were in print, you worked with data, now you're doing video, you're doing podcasts.
So what I'll say to that is, I think that for me, I think about how many tools can I put in my toolbox? I don't ever want the most amazing story to come to me and me be constricted by my medium. I don't want the best magazine story in the world to come to me, to fall in my inbox and me go, well, I'll write this as a newspaper piece, 50 inches. I don't want the best 60-minute segment to appear and me have to write it as a magazine piece. I don't want if I get a story and it's best told as a podcast, I want to be able to do it as a podcast, not have to bastardize it into a newspaper piece, whatever it is, right? Because what we know is that there are different ways to tell stories, and you can do excellent storytelling in any of these mediums. And so for me, I've really resisted over the course of my career being typecast via medium in any way. It's important to me to know how to do magazine writing. It's important to me to know how to do on-camera work, even if that is not the thing that I think is my life's work or what I aspire to do or want to do forever, right? It's important to me that I can do an investigative project at the Post, and I can also write the daily story onto the front page, and I can also do a feature story that I can do, because I don't know what story is going to present itself to me tomorrow, and I don't know which one of those things is going to matter. And I think that I had an editor I'm close with who meant very well when he said this to me at the time. But at one point, we were at a meeting, and he said, you're going to have to decide what type of journalist you want to be. Are you going to do these big swings? Are you going to influence the world in quicker things? Is it going to be more analysis? Is it going to be more straight? Is it going to be more investigative? Is it going to be more stylistic writing? And I have broken that rule in that I refuse dispositionally to make that decision. That I think I can be working on an investigation for the Washington Post that publishes later this year and be doing the cover story on Will Smith. It's a little voicey and has some stuff in it, and then shift and go do a straight 60-minute segment. And then that I do think that we don't have to be so rigid in terms of what this looks like. When I talk to students, I think about this all the time because I think, unfortunately, again, as much as I'm like the young rebel, I'm pretty traditional in journalism spaces. I've worked for newspapers. I worked for CBS and 60 Minutes. My body of work is straight news reporting almost exclusively. Again, with an occasional magazine piece where I have a little aside in it, but I do straight journalism. I don't do opinion for the most part. But I think that there's when I talk to students, I worry sometimes about the message that we as journalists send because the best journalists, I think, are passionate about things, and that we have a generation of students who've come up at a time of Black Lives Matter, of the Women's March, of a particularly divisive presidency, who are motivated, who are excited, who care deeply about climate activism and gun control activists, who care deeply about the world that they live in. And I don't want to say to them, well, you went to a march, you can never be a journalist. You care about the world you live in? Well, no, we have no room for you here. You know, look, I think there are professional trade-offs. Again, there are things I don't do because I don't endorse candidates. I don't, I'm not particularly outwardly partisan, even if times and there is a trade-off to that, right? It is a decision I'm making professionally. But I think those lines might be different and in different places, and I think your generations get to decide where some of those lines are compared to where other people have decided previously. But I just don't ever want I don't want anyone to get the message that because they care passionately, that there's not space for them in this industry. Because I actually think our industry needs many more people like that. And even if their job title looks different or they shift and change, I think that's all fine. But I think we want people who passionately care about our country and about our world and our society doing journalism. And the expression of that care should not be disqualifying, certainly not at the college age. Because look, if we went back and purged every newsroom of anyone who attended a Vietnam protest, there'd be none of the white guys who work in newsrooms would work there. And so we have to be willing to think about, today that might look like tweeting the words Black Lives Matter. I don't think that should purge you from the newsroom, right? And so in terms of storytelling, I mentioned earlier the piece I did from Vegas, and I like a lot if I could actually, maybe if I didn't really, really care about the work that I do in the specific lane I did, and it was like taking a job for fun, whatever that means, right? I would probably do quick hit narrative, and what I mean by that is narrative pieces written off of relative breaking news stories. Now, breaking news stories are often sad, so it's not necessarily fun, right? But I think a lot about storytelling even within the confines of a breaking news scenario. And so I talk and think about this piece I did from Vegas after the Harvest Festival mass shooting, the deadliest mass shooting in modern American history. And I did this piece about a man and a woman who had met at the festival. And as they were dancing, the woman was shot in the shooting, and the man got her out and put her in a truck to a hospital. And he spent the next 24 hours walking hospital trying to find her and trying to figure out what happened. And it was a story that was, done on deadline and within, in the heart of it. But that, for all the mass shootings I covered, which has been a lot of them, unfortunately, I'm of the mass shooting generation. Journalists my age, we've spent all of our time covering mass shooting to mass shooting to mass shooting. It was a story that was able to highlight the humanity and the experience that happens inside of a news event that has become cliche. Unfortunately, a mass shooting in America is a cliche event. We go through the motions, we know how this works, we know what happens. And how do we get people who've already done this a million times to stop and think? How do I get you to stop and think about this wildfire, stop and think about this hurricane? And the way to do it is by telling the story of real people. Not in quick one-offs where it's like a little anecdote and a quote, but actually sitting with their story. What does it look like to sit in this house as the floodwaters rise? What does it look like when you wake up to the flames and you have to figure out are you grabbing the cat or the dog, right? And so I think for me, that's a big part of the storytelling that I really value and I think is really important. I do not remember the third question.
That's okay, because you know what? We're going to have more time at the reception where people can come up and
Oh, I'm keeping you from cookies
ask
and
you
stuff.
questions.
All right.
Exactly. It's stupid.
Never mind, you don't care about the third question.
This was terrific. Thank you so much, Wes. It was great.
Thank you, guys.
And you can talk to us here. We're going to have a reception out there. And thank you all for coming.